That "he was SHT" line on the thumbnail isn't just trash talk. George Brett really explained why guys in MLB couldn't stand being around number 2, Mike Schmidt. And it wasn't even about batting. Picture it, split screen. George Brett talking now about the past, while number 2 is back there playing, ice cold, like nothing was wrong, like he didn't even notice the walls closing in. But people noticed. His own teammates noticed. The whole sport noticed. And the question everyone asks is, how can a guy be so great, so dominant, so talented at what he does, and still have that kind of hate coming at him from every direction? That's what we're diving into today. This isn't cheap drama. This is about professional resentment that legends like Brett are finally willing to explain. It's about the psychological warfare that defined an era. It's about how excellence can make you enemies. It's about how being too perfect can make you the loneliest guy in the clubhouse. This is about the fabric of a sport that rewards not just winning, but how you win. This is about what happens when perfection becomes a curse instead of a blessing. Also, if you're feeling this story already, tap the hype feature and give this video some hype. It helps a ton. Now let's get into why Schmidt rubbed legends the wrong way. And trust me, once you understand the real reason, it makes way more sense than you probably think. This goes deep. This goes into psychology. This goes into the very soul of what drove these men to be great, and how that greatness became poison for one of them. This is about 2 different approaches to excellence, and why only one of them was acceptable in 1970s baseball. Let's start at the beginning, in 1971. In that year, 2 kids changed baseball forever, but nobody knew it yet. The Kansas City Royals grabbed number 1, George Brett, out of El Segundo High School with the 29th pick in the 2nd round. They wanted to build something special in Kansas City. They wanted a franchise guy, someone who'd grow with the city, someone who'd bleed for the organization, someone who'd become synonymous with winning, someone the fans could believe in. Then, the Philadelphia Phillies turned right around and grabbed number 2, Mike Schmidt, out of Ohio University with the very next pick, the 30th pick, back to back. This wasn't a coincidence. This was the start of something that would define a generation of baseball forever. This was the moment that set up one of the most complex rivalries in sports history. Both teams were desperate in different ways. Kansas City was brand new to Major League Baseball. The Royals were an expansion franchise, trying to prove they belonged in the big leagues. They needed an identity. They needed a face. They needed someone their fans could believe in from day one, someone to make them feel legitimate, someone to prove that a new team could compete with the historic franchises. Philadelphia was old and tired. They'd been losing for years. They'd been mediocre forever. They'd lost important games. They'd missed the playoffs repeatedly. Their fans were frustrated. They needed a savior. They needed someone to transform the franchise. They needed hope. And suddenly, the 2 teams with the most pressing needs got the 2 best third basemen ever born in the same moment. George Brett and Mike Schmidt became linked forever. Not because they were friends, not because they liked each other, because the draft made them permanent rivals, because every comparison was inevitable, because the media, the fans, the other players would spend decades asking, who's better, who's superior, who's the real deal. Brett's early years were smooth, real smooth. He had a coach named Charlie Lau. Lau believed hitting was like mechanics. It was precise. It was scientific, but also fluid. Lau taught Brett that hitting wasn't about raw power. It was about understanding the physics, understanding the angles, understanding how to position your body and your hands to make consistent contact, understanding rhythm, understanding timing, understanding when to attack and when to wait. Brett learned everything from him. Brett became this contact hitter who could spray the ball anywhere on the field. He could use the whole diamond, left field, right field, center field. He was a craftsman. He became a Royals legend fast. People loved him. The city loved him. The fans felt connected to him. He made Kansas City feel big. He made Kansas City feel legitimate. He made Kansas City feel like winners. He became the face of the franchise in the way Schmidt never could in Philadelphia. Schmidt's early years were a nightmare, a real struggle, a trial by fire. His first year in 1972, he barely played. 13 games. He wasn't ready. He wasn't adjusted yet. The speed of the game was different. The pitchers were different. Everything was different. The learning curve was steep and unforgiving. He was overwhelmed. Then 1973 came, and he got real playing time, real opportunities, real at-bats. He struck out 136 times. That's an enormous amount. That's an alarming number. That's historically bad. That's the kind of number that ends careers. His average was .196. Let that sink in. In an entire season, he couldn't hit better than .196. That's among the lowest batting averages in modern baseball history. That means he was failing more than he was succeeding. That means for every hit, he was striking out or making an out many times. People in Philadelphia started calling him overmatched. They booed him relentlessly. They said he couldn't hit major league pitching. They said he'd never be a major leaguer. They said the Phillies made a huge mistake. They said they should have drafted someone else. And that was just the beginning. That early difference between them mattered. It shaped everything that came later. It gave Brett momentum and confidence. It gave Schmidt doubt and insecurity. It created a gap that would never fully close. But to understand number one, George Brett, you have to understand his dad. His father was Jack Brett. Jack was strict. He was serious. He didn't try to be mean. He was just obsessed with making sure George never got comfortable, never got satisfied, never thought he was good enough. Even when George hit .390 in 1980, his dad told him it wasn't enough. .390. That's almost 400. That's historic. That's Hall of Fame level. But for Jack, it still wasn't enough. When George went hitless in a game, his father called him. He'd criticize him. He'd be honest. Sometimes brutally honest. He'd compare him to George's brother, Ken. Ken was a pitcher. Ken was talented. Ken was a boy wonder, too. Ken could even hit sometimes better than George. That destroyed George. That made George hungry in a way that never went away. That paternal pressure created a monster. It created a competitor who couldn't turn it off. It created a fire that never burned out. George Brett hated losing more than anything. He hated opponents. He hated other teams. He said it himself. I hated all those guys because they were on the other team. That wasn't just talk. That wasn't locker room banter. That was his psychology. That was how he was built. That was his foundation. That was the core of his competitive drive. For Brett, the field was a war zone. Opponents weren't colleagues. They weren't fellow professionals deserving respect. They were enemies. They were adversaries. They were obstacles to the validation his father never fully gave him. That fire, that intensity, that hate was his fuel. It's what made him dangerous. It's what made him great. It's what kept him hungry every single season. Without that hatred, Brett believed he would lose his edge. Without that competitive fire, he would become complacent. Without that enemy mindset, he would fail. So the hatred wasn't something he wanted to get rid of. It was something he cultivated. He nurtured it. He used it. Number two, Mike Schmidt was different. Complete opposite. Schmidt was quiet. Schmidt was cerebral. Schmidt was aloof. Writers called him inscrutable. Other players said he was brooding. Schmidt looked like a machine. He looked emotionless, robotic, disconnected, automatic. But that wasn't the truth. Schmidt was actually super intelligent about the game. He was hard-nosed about his craft. He was fiercely attentive. He studied pitchers. He studied himself. He analyzed every at-bat. He was thoughtful and deliberate, but he used emotional detachment to survive. He kept his feelings inside. He kept his struggles private. He didn't share his pain publicly. He didn't let people see his vulnerability. In a sport where guys like Pete Rose played hard and got dirty and cussed and spit everywhere, Schmidt was different. He was Mr. Cool. He was the opposite of visceral. He was composed. He was analytical. And guys in that era resented that. They thought you had to show you cared. You had to show your passion. You had to bleed for the game. Literally bleed. You had to play with visible anger. You had to celebrate your hits. You had to show emotion on your face. Schmidt didn't do that. He was private. He wore hats and sunglasses to avoid attention. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to be left alone. And players thought that meant he didn't care. They thought he was spoiled. They thought he was cold. That perception haunted him. It followed him everywhere. It became part of his identity. It became harder to escape than any actual fact about him. In 1977, something happened that showed Schmidt wasn't totally ice cold. A pitcher named Bruce Kyson was pitching for Pittsburgh. Kyson was a headhunter. He threw at guys. He'd hit batters on purpose. He had a crazy record in the minors where he hit 7 guys in one game. One single game. That's insane. That shows how aggressive he was. Kyson threw one at Schmidt, hit him in the back. Schmidt was done being cool. He charged the mound immediately. He was fired up. He threatened Kyson. "Why don't you come now?" Kyson said back. And they went at it. A massive brawl. Ed Ott, Pittsburgh's catcher, wrestled Schmidt down. Greg Luzinski grabbed Kyson. It was chaos. It was violent. It was real. It was the kind of confrontation that could earn respect in baseball. But even that fight didn't change how people saw Schmidt. Even when he showed fire, even when he proved he could fight, people still saw him through the Mr. Cool lens. Kieson mocked him after, talked about Luzinski's body odor, trivialized the whole thing, made it a joke. And that was the pattern. Schmidt would do something to show he was tough, show he cared, and people still didn't believe him. They'd already made up their minds. The narrative was set. Nothing could change it. No amount of evidence could convince them otherwise. Philadelphia was brutal. The city was a mob scene. Veterans Stadium was like a war zone for the team's own players. Fans booed their own guys relentlessly. Fans were vicious. Fans were relentless. They held grudges. They demanded perfection and then booed you for being human. They wanted drama. In 1985, things got really bad. Schmidt had been playing great, but he made a comment about being more appreciated in a city like Los Angeles or Chicago. The Broad Street Boo-Birds lost their minds. People were angry. The fans were vicious. His own teammates got scared. They didn't want to stand next to him during drills because they thought the fans might turn on them too. They feared guilt by association. They worried about being caught in the crossfire. That's when Larry Anderson, his teammate, had an idea, a brilliant idea, a desperate idea. On July 1st, 1985, Schmidt came out wearing a long, curly, crimson wig and Porsche sunglasses. He was hiding. It was a joke. It was a way to diffuse the tension and the anger. It worked. The fans laughed. The boos turned into cheers. It was like a witness protection program on the field. One man trying to escape his own city. One Hall of Famer pretending to be someone else. One of the greatest players ever having to hide. But to guys like number one, Brett, this was proof that something was fundamentally wrong with Schmidt. A Hall of Famer shouldn't have to wear a wig to avoid being booed by his own fans. That shouldn't be necessary. That shouldn't happen to a champion. That didn't happen to Brett in Kansas City. That disconnect made Schmidt look even more alien, even more different. Pete Rose came to Philadelphia in 1979. Rose was a salesman. Rose was a master of the media. Rose understood how to talk to people. Rose knew how to work the press. Rose had charisma. Pete Rose protected Schmidt. Rose took the pressure off Schmidt by talking to reporters instead. Rose gave Schmidt a nickname, Herbie Lee. It was supposed to humanize him, make him seem normal, make him seem human, make people see the real person underneath. Rose kept telling everyone how great Schmidt was. Rose defended him in the media. Rose tried to loosen Schmidt up. Rose did all the things Schmidt couldn't do for himself. Rose was like a psychological shield, and that actually made things worse in some ways. It made it seem like Schmidt needed a babysitter, like he couldn't handle the game on his own terms, like he wasn't a natural leader, like he needed help to function. Dick Allen was another mentor. Allen was another aloof guy. Allen had the same expressionless style that people thought was arrogant. Allen knew what it was like to be misunderstood. Allen knew what it was like to be resented. Allen had played in Philadelphia too. Allen had experienced the same hostility. Dick Allen taught Schmidt how to deal with being hated in Philadelphia. Allen told him to relax. Allen said, you just have to accept that the city will turn on you and move on. You have to develop thick skin. You have to keep your head down. You have to accept the pain. But again, this meant Schmidt needed help. He needed mentors to tell him how to survive. He needed coaching on how to be a person. Number one, Brett didn't need that. Brett was natural. Brett was the leader of his team on the field and in the clubhouse. Brett didn't fear baseball. Brett's charisma unified people. Brett made people want to follow him. That was the difference between them. Brett was built for success. Schmidt had to learn it. The 1980 World Series was the ultimate moment, the definitive stage. Both guys were at their absolute peak. Both were the MVPs of their leagues, basically. Brett had spent the whole season chasing .400. He was the most dangerous hitter in baseball, the most feared, the most respected. Number two, Schmidt had finally proven he could perform under pressure. He was a benchmark player, a full player. For the first time, he looked like he belonged with the absolute greatest. For the first time, he looked like a superstar. But during that series, Brett made a choice. He tried to avoid Schmidt at all costs. Not because he hated him personally, because recognizing Schmidt's humanity would be weak. Brett's whole psychology was built on hating opponents. If Brett admitted Schmidt was great, if Brett talks to him, if Brett saw him as a real person, it would break his focus. It would weaken his edge. It would make him vulnerable. So Brett stayed away. He kept his distance. He maintained his wall. The Phillies won that series in 6 games. Schmidt was the MVP. He batted .381. He had 2 home runs. He had 7 RBIs. He was dominant, mechanical, perfect, clinical excellence. But the story everyone remembers is different. Brett had hemorrhoids during that series. Really bad hemorrhoids. Painful. Serious. People made jokes. Greg Nettles and others would laugh and say, "Behind you now," to Brett. That's a hemorrhoid joke. It was crude. It was also perfect for the narrative. Because here's the thing. Brett played through it. He played hurt. He showed pain. He made himself human and relatable. He bled. He suffered publicly. He was vulnerable. Schmidt, meanwhile, was clinical, perfect, cold, untouchable. He didn't show struggle. He didn't complain. He didn't let people see his pain. Years later, in 2013, he revealed he'd had stage 3 melanoma, skin cancer, life-threatening cancer. But during his career, he kept that private too. He never mentioned it. He never used it as an excuse. In the culture of 1980s baseball, you had to bleed. You had to show your damage. You had to prove you cared by being willing to suffer publicly. Schmidt refused to do that, and it made him seem like a machine, like he wasn't human, like he didn't care about the game the way real players did. The comparison thing never stopped. Because they were drafted next to each other, because they played the same position, they became eternal rivals in people's minds. They became symbols. But it was more than that. It was about style. It was about philosophy. It was about what baseball was supposed to be. Brett's hitting style was about making contact. It was flowing. It was beautiful to watch. It was art. It was elegant. Schmidt's style was rigid, pull-heavy, launch-angle focused. It was about maximum power. It was mechanical. It was brutal. It was functional. And people resented Schmidt because his ugly swing was more effective. He hit more home runs. He had more power. He had higher WAR. His unattractive approach worked better than Brett's pure approach. His science beat their art. That created a real resentment. Peers looked at Schmidt and thought, how is a guy with such a mechanical, robotic swing better than our guy? How is he hitting more home runs? How is he more valuable? The answer was that baseball was changing. The game was becoming more scientific, more data-driven. Hitting for power was starting to matter more than hitting for average. And Schmidt was ahead of his time. But in 1970s and 1980s baseball, that made him a villain. That made him an outsider. That made him the enemy of tradition. The hitting philosophies of the era were in direct conflict. Schmidt was dominant in ways that created pure envy. He led the National League in home runs 8 times. 8 times. He won 10 Gold Gloves. 10. That combination at third base had never been seen before. His 509 home runs at the position are still historic. His 1,419 RBIs at third base are still the benchmark. His dominance was overwhelming. The hatred was partly just jealousy, pure envy, raw resentment. When a guy makes hard plays look routine and never complains and stays totally calm about it, other guys hate him. It's human nature. When Brett couldn't stand to lose even a card game, watching Schmidt maintain his composure after striking out infuriated him. It drove him crazy. It made him feel small. But there was also the clutch narrative that stuck to Schmidt, a narrative that was partly true and partly myth. People said his home runs came in blowouts, blowout games. Games that didn't matter. People said he padded his stats in games that didn't matter. People said he was a frontrunner who disappeared when the pressure was highest. That was unfair. That was partly media constructed. That was partly resentment. But once a narrative like that starts, it sticks. It becomes part of the fabric. It becomes accepted truth. Brett, meanwhile, was treated as the clutch guy, the dangerous guy, the guy who came through, the guy you had to walk. Sparky Anderson said he feared Brett like he feared Willie McCovey. Anderson would intentionally walk Brett to avoid his power. That was respect. That was fear. That was acknowledgement of greatness. Schmidt didn't get that respect. Schmidt got suspicion. Schmidt got doubt. He got scrutiny. The 1985 hitting coach situation showed that this stuff never really died. Decades later, old wounds remained. In 2013, Brett served as interim hitting coach for the Royals. He lasted 8 weeks. 8 weeks for a Hall of Famer. 8 weeks for a guy with 3,000 hits. Why? According to Mike Schmidt later, Brett quit because he felt like he was wasting everyone's time. Modern hitters didn't want his advice. They lined up to hit with an assistant coach, while Brett, a guy with 3,000 hits, was in another cage trying to flip balls, and nobody cared. Young players today don't want coaching from legends. They want to hear what they want to hear. They want coaching from people who don't push them hard. They want comfort, not challenge. They want to be told they're good. Brett wanted to teach them how to be great. That frustrated Brett. That made him quit. And Schmidt pointed out that this showed modern baseball had lost something essential: the intensity, the urgency, the respect for expertise, the understanding that greatness comes from pain. Philadelphia's media environment made everything worse for Schmidt. The Knight Ridder reporters were relentless, aggressive, demanding. They found Schmidt moody. They found him cold. They published that constantly. Because Schmidt was analytical, he gave short answers. He didn't give them colorful quotes. He didn't make their jobs easy. He was boring to them. So they labeled him aloof. They wrote him off. They created a narrative that served their purposes. They needed drama. They needed controversy. They needed something to write about. Schmidt's silence was suspicious. His lack of outbursts was seen as indifference. His refusal to play the media game was interpreted as arrogance. Fans read that and booed him for being arrogant. They believed what the media wrote. The media was the authority. The media spoke truth. So if the media said Schmidt was cold and aloof, then he must be. They formed their opinions based on what reporters told them. They didn't know Schmidt. They didn't talk to him. They only knew what they read. Players on other teams read it and developed their own ideas about who Schmidt was before they ever met him. They arrived at Veterans Stadium with preconceived notions. They thought Schmidt was difficult. They thought he was a loner. They thought he didn't respect the game. That media-created persona became real in people's minds. That's why Brett avoided him in 1980. That's why other legends developed this hatred. It was partly real and partly manufactured. It was a feedback loop that got stronger every year. Media plus fans plus players, all reinforcing the same narrative over and over. The narrative became reality. The story became truth. The sociological moment matters too. The 1970s were cynical. Post-Vietnam, post-Watergate. Trust in institutions had collapsed. The government had lied. The war was wrong. People were angry. The reserve clause got struck down by the courts. Free agency was born. Everything changed forever. Everything became about money. Everything became about leverage and negotiation and power. Schmidt was one of the first guys to really benefit from free agency. He signed huge contracts that would have been impossible before. That wealth made him seem corporate, made him seem like a mercenary, a guy who played for paychecks, not pride, a businessman, not a player, a selfish professional who thought only about himself. But that was unfair. Schmidt didn't create free agency. Schmidt didn't force Philadelphia to pay him. He simply took advantage of his leverage. He simply demanded what he was worth. He simply refused to accept the feudal system that had bound players to single teams forever. He was actually a pioneer. He was actually brave. But the old guard saw him as greedy. The fans saw him as someone who didn't love the game. The teammates saw him as someone who valued money over the team. Brett, by contrast, stayed with Kansas City. Brett was the franchise guy. Brett was the community icon. Brett was loyal. That distinction was huge. Community guy versus corporate guy. That's a big part of the hatred Brett talked about. Brett was seen as a hero. Schmidt was seen as a sellout. But the truth is, both of them were just trying to do what was best for themselves and their families. The difference was how they were perceived. The difference was the narrative. The difference was that Brett played in a city where people loved him unconditionally. Schmidt played in a city where people turned on him. There was also the brotherly competition thing. Brett had an older brother, Ken. Ken was a pitcher who made the World Series at 19 years old with the Red Sox. Ken was a boy wonder, a phenom. George was 4 years younger and spent his whole childhood in Ken's shadow, always compared, always measured against. When George made the majors, everything was compared. His dad would remind him of Ken's accomplishments. That created this permanent feeling of not being enough, not being the favorite, not being chosen. When Brett looked at Schmidt and saw a guy who seemingly achieved perfection without visible struggle, without showing pain, without needing mentors, it triggered something deep. It triggered that inadequacy, that old wound, that family pain. And that inadequacy came out as hatred. Pete Rose came to Philadelphia in 1979. Rose was a salesman. Rose was a master of the media. Rose understood how to talk to people. Rose knew how to work the press. Pete Rose protected Schmidt. Rose gave Schmidt a nickname, Herbie Lee. Rose kept telling everyone how great Schmidt was. Rose tried to loosen Schmidt up. Dick Allen was another mentor. Allen taught Schmidt how to deal with being hated in Philadelphia. Allen said, "You just have to accept the city and move on." But this meant Schmidt needed help. He needed mentors. Number one, Brett didn't need that. Brett was natural. Brett's charisma unified people. Steve Carlton was another player in that Phillies organization. Carlton was also aloof. Carlton was also focused on individual excellence. Carlton was an artist, but Carlton was a pitcher. Pitchers got different treatment. Pitchers were expected to be weird and private. That was normal for pitchers. For a position player like Schmidt, being aloof was wrong. Being private was suspicious. That unfairness stuck with him. So let's synthesize all of this. The hatred George Brett finally revealed wasn't about Mike Schmidt being a bad person. It wasn't about Schmidt being evil or wrong. It was about what Schmidt represented. Schmidt represented change. Schmidt represented precision and science, taking over a game that had been about passion and grit. Schmidt represented a future that made old-school players uncomfortable. Schmidt represented pressure. He represented perfection. He represented intimidation through excellence rather than personality. He represented a new era that the old guard wasn't ready for. He represented a threat to the traditional way of doing things. Brett's hatred was functional. It was a tool. It was how he motivated himself. It came from his strict father and his desperate need for approval. It came from his competitiveness. It came from his belief that opponents were enemies. That was real. That was how he wired himself to play. That was his psychological foundation. But it was also projection. It was also about something Schmidt represented to him that he couldn't fully accept. Fear, maybe. Jealousy, maybe. The threat of becoming obsolete. The fear that his way of doing things might not be the best way. The fear that emotion might not matter anymore. The fear that perfection could be quiet. Schmidt's aloofness was a survival mechanism, a deliberate strategy. Philadelphia was hostile. The fans were brutal. The media was relentless. The city was against him every single day. Schmidt couldn't be the glad-handing salesman that Pete Rose was. He couldn't be the joke teller. He couldn't be the guy who made people laugh and won people over with charm. That wasn't who he was naturally, so he withdrew. He used distance as protection. He used emotional detachment as a shield. That made him look cold, but it also meant the hostility couldn't touch him as deeply. That strategy protected him psychologically, but it cost him. It cost him the respect and affection of his peers. It cost him being understood. The wig incident of 1985 symbolized everything perfectly. Here was a Hall of Famer, one of the greatest players ever, so hated by his own fans that he had to wear a disguise. That's not normal. That's not what champions experience. That's tragedy. That's heartbreaking and revealing. And that tragedy made him different in the eyes of guys like Brett. Brett never experienced that. Nobody booed Brett. Nobody forced Brett to wear a wig to avoid abuse. Brett was loved unconditionally, and that gap between them, that difference in how they were treated by their cities, by their peers, created a permanent rift. It made them fundamentally different people, with fundamentally different experiences of what it meant to be great. It created a divide that could never fully be bridged. In the final analysis, the friction between Brett and Schmidt was the friction of baseball in transition. It was old world versus new world. It was local icon versus corporate superstar. It was emotion versus intellect. It was art versus science. These weren't just personality differences. These were different philosophies about how to live, how to compete, how to survive. These represented fundamentally different worldviews. George Brett's candid admissions about the hatred he felt weren't diminishing Mike Schmidt's legacy. They were humanizing the competitive furnace that created two of the greatest athletes the sport has ever seen. The hatred was real. It was also honest. It was also necessary. In a sport that demanded excellence, that demanded dominance, that demanded perfection, sometimes you had to hate your opponent to find your best self. Sometimes you had to turn competitors into enemies. Sometimes you had to dehumanize the opposition to reach peak performance. And sometimes, when your opponent looked too different, when they seemed too cold, when they represented something too foreign, that hatred became something darker and more complex than simple competition. It became existential. It became about defending a way of life. The third base paradox is this. The more perfect a player becomes, the less human they seem to their contemporaries. The more flawless the execution, the more robotic they appear. Mike Schmidt was perfect. He was dominant. He was mechanically flawless. But that perfection came at a cost. It cost him the camaraderie that other players took for granted. It cost him the respect that comes from being relatable. It cost him the love of his city. It cost him connection. It cost him belonging. George Brett, by contrast, was relatable. He bled. He struggled. He needed validation. He showed his pain publicly. And because of that humanity, because of that visibility of his pain, he was beloved. He won the heart of his city. He made people feel connected to him. That's what George Brett was really saying when he revealed why MLB legends hated Mike Schmidt. It wasn't hate in the evil sense. It wasn't about disliking him as a person. It was hate in the sense of fundamental misunderstanding. It was hate because they couldn't accept what Schmidt represented. It was hate because they couldn't penetrate his cool exterior to find the humanity underneath. It was hate based on a philosophy that excellence had to be visible, had to be emotional, had to be earned through visible suffering. And in a sport that values the unwritten rules as much as the written ones, that values the fight as much as the stats, that values tradition competition as much as winning, that kind of distance and detachment became unforgivable. It became a sin. It became something that had to be punished through resentment and avoidance. It became impossible to overcome. The narrative was too strong. But here's the thing that makes this story beautiful and complicated. Both men were right. Brett was right that Schmidt seemed cold. Schmidt was right to protect himself. Brett was right that the game demanded visible passion. Schmidt was right that excellence could be quiet and dignified. They were just two different approaches to the same challenge: how to be great in a sport that is fundamentally about proving yourself against others every single day. They were two different solutions to the same problem, and both solutions worked. Both produced Hall of Famers. Both produced excellence. But only one was acceptable to the culture of their time. Now you've got the full story complete. You've got the complete context. You've got the hatred explained completely and honestly. You understand why it happened. You understand what drove it. You understand the complexity behind it. You understand both sides. Like this video if it hit you hard. Subscribe to this channel because we're going to keep breaking down the stories that sports legends never wanted you to know. We're going to keep diving into the psychological depths of these rivalries. We're going to keep exploring what it means to be great. And comment down below, who do you think was right? Was Brett's visible fire the right way to achieve greatness? Or was Schmidt's quiet excellence the right way? Was one approach superior, or were they just different? Let me know in the comments. Tell me what you think. Tell me which approach resonates with you. Thanks for watching so intently, and we'll catch you on the next one.